Welcome to Beyond the Balance Sheet, the podcast that helps advisors, clinical professionals, and affluent families understand the complexities of issues related to our mental, physical, and emotional well-being. Our co-hosts, Arden O'Connor and Diana Clark, will interview a series of guests on a range of topics, providing informative content and practical tools for professionals and families to consider. Here are your hosts, Arden and Diana.
Hi, everyone, and welcome to another episode of Beyond the Balance Sheet podcast. Today, we are going to be talking about building financial resilience with our guest, Todd Carey. Todd, thank you so much for joining us.
Hi, Arden. Thank you for having me.
Well, I thought I'd start in with just a quick background for our listeners and some of our viewers. So Todd is certainly no stranger to strategic planning, execution, and has been working throughout his entire career to help others succeed. Prior to entering the wealth management industry, he played professional baseball for over 8 seasons with the Boston Red Sox, New York Mets, and Los Angeles Dodgers. And he brings that level of talent, discipline, and energy to his position at UBS Private Wealth Management, where he and his partner, Joseph McKeever, provide advice and solutions to an executive and affluent group of families and individuals. So welcome, Todd. What an interesting career. I guess my first question is how did you make the transition? And are there things that you brought in to your wealth management career that were applicable in your baseball career?
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks again for having me. I was lucky enough to be drafted by the Boston Red Sox when I was a junior at Brown University and, had a chance to play professional baseball for, parts of 7 seasons. I took a few investment classes when I was at Brown. My father was involved in finance and learned a bit from him growing up and was just always interested in the markets, interested in portfolio management and asset allocation. When I had a chance to transition from baseball, sort of to the world of finance, I went back for my MBA, which was great for me. 2 years of transitioning, learning about finance and transitioning from baseball to the kind of the real world, as I say, at Bryant University. And I was able to, land a summer internship with Lehman Brothers, and then that turned into a full-time job, and I started as a investment rep, up in Boston for Lehman Brothers. But I was always interested in finance. I was always interested in talking to people and building relationships, particularly about their portfolio management and their investments. That just always captured my attention. Working with families and individuals, it's a lot of relationship building, a lot of deep conversations about what they have planned for the future, not quite as transactional as, maybe on the institutional side. So for me, that was the attraction. And I tried to find an industry and a job that, kind of matched my skills and my interests, with a career. So that's how I ended up in this business.
Interesting.
Yeah. And in terms of, what I learned, certainly playing sports, you learn a lot of skills around confidence and discipline and hard work and, trying to master a specific task. I think playing professional baseball, meeting people from all walks of life in different countries, really, I learned how to communicate with different people, how to get on the same page with everybody. And, baseball is a great team sport. You have your own individual requirements and individual, goals and jobs to get done, but it's all within a team setting and you're all pulling in the same direction. So, for me, professional sports, taught me a lot.
It's an interesting switch, and it makes sense that there are some things you learned in baseball that applied to your career. Did you find you were unique among your peers when it came time to transition, that you had an established goal in your mind? Or did you find other peers had similar thoughts early in their careers? I know I'm going to have to leave this field at some point and I have ideas later. Or were you unique in that position?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think there were many players, on my teams that, were sort of born and bred to be a professional athlete, and there was no real plan B. As a kid, my parents, sort of raised me to be, educated and also, enjoy sports. And when I got to Brown and started to do well and, gain some attention from the professional scouts, I kind of viewed that as gravy. That was sort of, if I had a chance to extend my career past, the college, baseball level, it was gravy. I always knew that I had an education to fall back on, but, many players don't do that. And, we work with a few people involved in professional sports, and, there are some lessons, to be learned. I think a lot of players don't really plan for the future. There's a very short window of their earning capability, right? It's usually 3 to 5 years, and they're young people when their careers come to an end. And, unless they have a plan in place for the future, both financially, and for, just general, goals and achievements later in life, it can be difficult for them. So, we do work with a few people in this space, and we're always trying to putting a plan in place. We're always trying to think about their next steps, try to really understand, that they're going to have to live off the money that they make at a very early age, for a very long time. Obviously, if they make enough money, it's a little bit easier to do that. But, most of the professional athletes require a plan and require some thought and assistance around this. And, people get into trouble if there's, if they don't have that plan in place. So certainly a lot of things I learned when I was playing and saw and witnessed and kind of experienced, helped me in my financial life later. So
I think it's an important role to play. And when I think about players as people who are so passionate and have been, as you said, born and bred, with this idea of who they are, and their identity is wrapped up in that. And it's such a powerful thing, but it also, to your point, can be challenging if you're forced to, change what your career looks like, which I think when you talk about a professional athlete is more tied to who you are than many other professions. Related to that is the piece that you brought up about the financial challenges that can come if you don't have a plan in place. How do you see people kind of weather the financial storm and deal with either uncertainty as we're living in now, or financial challenges either more successfully or less successfully?
Yeah, that's a great question. Everyone needs a plan, and not just professional athletes, but, business owners, corporate executives who, most of the families that we work with, they need a plan. And the people who weather the storm stick to the plan. They execute the plan. Certainly, there are times when it's a little bit more difficult to do that. But I think, we have a framework here at UBS where we look at, it's called Wealth Way. We look at the client's assets in 3 distinct buckets: liquidity, longevity, and legacy. And liquidity is, assets that they're going to tap into in the next, 1 to 3 years. Longevity is for the rest of their lives, and legacy are assets that, are going to outlive them and pass on to their next kids, to their kids or whoever they want to give it to. And that's a great framework to kind of set up for our clients, because it gives them a real plan, gives them a lot of confidence. It helps them understand that when the markets, experience volatility, they don't need to come off the plan. They can still, so there's a lot of flexibility into that plan. But those who, weather the storm have a plan in place. They work with us to stick to that plan, and, execute that plan so that, they have better outcomes over the long term. The last thing you want to do is act irrationally and, make changes based on what you see on CNBC or what you're hearing, out and about. It's just better to have that plan in place and to work with an advisor that can help you stick to that plan. But, it's not just true with professional athletes. It's true with a lot of business owners and corporate executives. People who have wealth and have complex financial pictures, they need a plan in place. And we're here to help and help them execute that plan.
In addition to the planning piece, are there other characteristics or traits that you see in people who have more trouble financially when challenges pop up or when there's volatility in the markets?
Yeah, coming into the pandemic, we saw a lot of investors, stretch for returns because it was hard to find decent returns in public markets, going into the pandemic. And all that does is really put more risk into your portfolio, so that when you do experience volatility, your portfolio is going to be even more affected by the ups and downs. So in addition to sort of coming off the plan, I think the biggest thing that we saw was, people considering or attempting to try to add more risk in the portfolio to increase their returns, and that typically doesn't work well. So I think when market shakeouts or wars or pandemics arise, we work with our clients. We try to show them a lot of empathy. We know that there's greater levels of uncertainty out there, and if you sold your business and have a pool of assets all of a sudden and the markets experience a lot of volatility, it can be very unsettling. And what we try to do is show them a lot of empathy and communicate with them. Take a deep breath and really try to have a thoughtful plan in place and make some good rational decisions. I think our job is to really advise them not to do that, and we do understand that that's difficult at certain times, but we want to bring them back to the plan and have them make good decisions. But certainly monitoring your portfolio allocation prior to any of these events, it's important at all times, but certainly through the any sort of pandemic, it becomes even more important.
Has the pandemic redefined for your clients what the term long-term planning means? Do you see people who are less sure that that's something important to consider, or do you see any major shifts across all of your clients, financially well off or not?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think it certainly brings more uncertainty, to a lot of people. I think, people consider their mortality a little bit more when these things come up. I think it certainly opens their eyes to unexpected events. The possibility, of these events, becomes greater. I think, the good news is when these things do happen, people do focus on it. They focus on long-term planning. And while we try to, set up a long-term plan for all of our clients, initially when we start with them, certainly these events will sort of exacerbate, those issues that come up. I think people want to gain some control of their future when times are uncertain, and this plan and the long-term planning, that goes along with it, I think, comes into a little bit more focus for them. So yeah, I mean, the other thing is, people were generally home a little bit more during the pandemic. Yes. And I think a lot of the things on the wealth management side got kicked, like typical business, people are busy, the wealth management, the personal planning gets kicked to the back. And I think when they're home and they're starting to, be a little bit more concerned about these things, I think, one good thing that came out of all this is that people had a chance to re-engage and refocus, on their long-term planning. So, for me, the optimist, I think I think some good things came out of it, and it was, calling attention to people's plans and focusing a little bit more on that,
It's funny you say that. We talked a lot during the pandemic about what fields experienced an increase, and I'm going to pivot to the mental health field in a minute. We certainly saw an increase in need for our services, but we heard similarly from trust and estate attorneys. Just, to your point, people had been putting off healthcare proxies and decisions around estate planning for years, but now they were at home and frankly, the possibility of death became more real. So they suddenly focused attention on that. The other area, just anecdotally, you mentioned people being in their homes. I know the home design business and Wayfair and all these companies providing furniture went through the roof because people, I think, are much more aware of the environments they're living in and thinking about how do you kind of reposition things when you're not on the road all the time. So to switching gears a little bit, have you encountered clients that you've worked with who have struggled with mental health challenges, and what's been your involvement in those types of situations?
Yeah, absolutely. I've experienced it personally, in my family. I've experienced it, in my prior career in baseball. And, we certainly have clients and families that, have experienced that, in their lives. The good news is I think there's no stigma attached to it the way there once was. Certainly when I was playing baseball, it's not something you really heard a lot about. It's not something that organizations, were prepared to discuss, were prepared to deal with. It was typically the responsibility, the onus, was all on the player to really understand that. You didn't really hear about it. I think people were ashamed. That's changed. There's a lot more resources, a lot more education, a lot more conversations about it. And I think that's a great thing. I think in terms of financial planning and wealth management, dealing with families that have, addiction or, mental health issues in their family, it leads to a lot of sensitive conversations. And so, we try to steer them and to guide them just to have the conversations, not necessarily for us to say how it should be handled. We have some great outside partners that we work with. We also have an internal resources called our Family Advisory Services, and they are really there to help the family sit down together, open lines of communication, discuss, all the issues that may come up around family planning and their values and long-term effectiveness of the family working together. It's a great resource for us, particularly mental health and addiction. That is something that brings the families to the table, and we've utilized that resource internally for us. But there's a lot of issues that need to be considered from a financial planning perspective when that issue arises in families, and I think there's a couple of things that are required. There's a lot of flexibility that needs to be built into a plan. I'm sure you've heard the expression fair but not equal. Some kids may require more assets to be healthy than others. There's a lot of things that hiring a professional trustee who is used to dealing with issues, if you are setting up trust to take care of somebody with that particular issue, that becomes vitally important. So, there's interesting and kind of unique ways to work with families that have this. And our job is, again, not to settle how they handle it, but really just to help them design plans with, however they decided to move forward with that. But, definitely an issue we're seeing more of.
You brought up one of my favorite phrases, this fair but not equal, or not fair but equal, however you want to say it. I guess my question related to that is, what is your response? Because I understand you're not the mental health clinician coming in to resolve the family's, challenging dynamics. But have you seen families make missteps around potentially offering somebody, a sibling, as a trustee in a situation that doesn't make sense to do so? And what is your role if you see people trying to do something they think is in the best intentions of the family, but you have your own concerns financially about whether it makes sense?
Yeah, absolutely. I'm just thinking about one particular client that we work with where there were two brothers. One had some mental health issues, and he was the younger brother. The older brother wanted to be that guardian. He was always looking out. Obviously his heart was in the best place, but it's a tremendous amount of work to be a trustee, and work, with a family member that requires, very special needs. And the family originally set up the older brother to be the trustee and the guardian and kind of really handle it because the brother really wanted to. But he just ran into, he had his own career and family, and he just ran into time issues and being able to, and, he almost had a nervous breakdown, trying to, be all things to his younger brother. And again, his heart, his intentions were right, but it's just really hard. So I think, delicately, we tried to, introduce that family to a corporate or a professional trustee who's used to having this, work with the family, understand what the goals are, understand, the beneficiary and the requirements and the needs and everything, and just basically take a little bit of stress off of the older brother, and, work with an outside partner. And I think that, led to some better outcomes, for the family. And I think they're in a much better spot than they were before.
It's a great example because I think you've hit the nail on the head when you describe the brother who has the best of intentions and even the desire to be helpful, but doesn't realize when, my favorite phrase is someone gets over their ski tips. They're in the middle of it and then they're trying to balance their own needs and they realize, this is just much more filled with crisis and it's starting to impede on my other obligations. So I think it's a great role to play. It's a great role to play. One comment I wanted to go back to that you mentioned is that you feel like there's less stigma attached to mental health. Are you seeing that with even athletes who are very much in the public eye, or families that you work with of high net worth that are in the public eye? Are you seeing that they're willing to either admit that there's an issue within their family system or admit that they themselves need help? Or do you still think there's any type of reluctance to look vulnerable and talk about these issues publicly?
Yeah, no, I think you're seeing it, in professional sports at least. The female tennis player Osaka, she just this past weekend, came out and said she was battling again at another, tennis event. Yeah, I think it's still tough. I think it's, not a decision that professional athletes, make very easily, but I think they are absolutely more willing to discuss it. They're absolutely more willing to show their vulnerability. They're absolutely more willing to show that, they have a lot of pressure and they can't necessarily, deal with it all directly. And I think that's a great thing. In terms of most of the families we work with, it's not quite as prevalent, but there's definitely, some families that have that. And I think, experience that. And I think people are more aware of the resources and the education around it all now. So I think it's a great thing. But yeah, I definitely, if you pay attention to the sports world, there's more and more of that coming out, almost every year in terms of athletes struggling with their mental health. And I think the organizations, have to build in and are beginning to build in, some resources for these athletes, to handle that. There's just more and more pressure. There's more and more limelight. They're making more and more money. It's like everything has been ramped up and escalated,
Absolutely.
pretty significantly in the last, 10 to 15 years. And I think that's just put more pressure, on the athletes themselves, whether they're in a team framework or individually. But, I just hope the organizations, are willing to continue and improve their resources, to help these athletes in the future.
To your earlier point, especially in baseball, given the short window of the career, I can't imagine the pressure that's on these athletes who suddenly go from being, superstars, what feels like overnight, maybe not to them, but to many of us, then, transitioning into a different field and all the pressures that come with how do you go back to living a normal life when, how you were identified even by the public and externally is not lost, but it's certainly changed.
Yeah, the professional athletes feel it, but I would also say that, we work with a lot of business owners, who decide to sell their business, and business owners, their identity gets tied up, into their business, almost, exactly like, professional athlete, being on the field of competition. The business owners, sometimes when they sell their business, it's a really difficult transition to the next phase of their life. And I think a lot of them don't feel like they have, a plan in place or a goal, personally, just to feel fulfilled, with the next stage of their lives. And business owners, they certainly get wrapped up, their identity gets wrapped up, in their business. And I think, we're here to help them with that. There's obviously some things we can answer. There's some things that we can turn to some external partners to help them, with that and to have, family discussions. But, I think it doesn't just happen with athletes. I think business owners really, get wrapped up in that too.
It's a great point. And, on the side of the business we're on, we're often seeing people in their 60s, 70s, 80s who perhaps drank within normal limits, maybe a little on the high side, but then suddenly retire, sell their business, and they lose that sense of purpose and a little bit of their identity and are now struggling with more serious either psychiatric issues or substance use issues. And some of it, I think, is because they're not quite sure how to derive, a schedule anymore. They're not quite sure what their days are supposed to be filled with. And while maybe the ideal, they in the beginning said, wouldn't it be great to be on the golf course every day? Suddenly, when that becomes a reality, it's a little more challenging than they had imagined.
Yes, absolutely. We have one client who retired at a fairly early age and, said, just almost exactly what you said, was, I started to play golf every day and, have lunch and dinner and drinks at the club. Next thing I knew, I was 60 pounds heavier and, wondering what I'm doing with my life. And he went back to work. So, it's not easy to plan necessarily in advance because, sometimes a buyer, for your business comes out of nowhere and you decide that, the timing is right. And so you haven't really planned, but eventually it's important to think about, sort of what are the next stages, not just financially where we can help, but just in general, with your life and how do you find purpose and, be fulfilled on a daily basis. But yeah, we certainly have seen people retire and then go back to work because they realize, listen, you saw with Tom Brady, over the last couple of days, he decided retirement was for him. So it's a lot more prevalent than you think.
I think that's exactly right. And if we can take one tip from the millennials, I think it's in earlier life, if it's possible, to develop some hobbies or outside interests that you potentially could get more intensively involved in as your work obligations become less intense. I notice with peers, my parents and others in that age group, that wasn't sort of the norm. You worked and then you came home and dealt with family. And so kind of dealing with that transition is much more challenging. Well, to end on a positive note, I'd be curious to hear, what would you tell your 25-year-old self if you had to go back in time? What do you wish you knew at that age as you were starting in your career, or maybe midway through your baseball career, at least?
Yeah. Well, I would say two different things. In baseball, I was 25 when I was playing, and, for me, it was just, continuing to build my skills and my confidence. All of a sudden I found myself playing, with the best, baseball players on the planet. And, some days that was, a little challenging. And I think the best players that I saw, the Hall of Famers, tended not to get into big swings, meaning they didn't swing up and swing down quite as much. They were steady and consistent performers. And, I struggled, at times I was really good, at times I was really bad. And it was more difficult for me to kind of climb out of those holes. When you watch the best players, in any sport, they tend to self-correct pretty quickly and get out of that. So I'd go back and tell myself to probably, find a little bit more confidence to just be able to dig myself out of those holes a little quicker. It's funny. And then I transitioned to the business world when I was 30 after business school. And, some similar things. I was a relatively young person going into a very successful family or business owner, sitting down and, what did I know about helping that particular family? But, a lot of questions and a lot of learning about the resources we have. Eventually I became confident that, and really understood that, these people need help. And, they might have an advisor that's maybe not the right advisor for that family anymore, or they don't have an advisor because they just have been too busy, working and living their lives. And I think I learned after a few years that, these people actually, they need help around their financial plan. And I kind of changed my mindset instead of, just trying to go in and have a conversation with them, but, really trying to highlight how we might be able to help those individuals and asking a lot of questions and learning about it. So it's probably the advice I would give back to myself at that time.
Well, thank you, Todd. This has been a great conversation. Really appreciate your honesty, your candor, your sense of humor. Excited that you were able to participate today.
Yes, thank you so much for having me. It's been a lot of fun.
Absolutely. And thank you to all our viewers and our listeners. If you're so inclined, please find Beyond the Balance Sheet on your podcast platform of choice and leave us a review, hopefully a good one, and we will see you on our next episode. Thank you.
Thank you for listening to Beyond the Balance Sheet, a podcast designed to help advisors, clinical professionals, and affluent families solve some of their biggest medical, psychiatric, and emotional challenges. Visit beyondthebalancesheet.com to read more about our guests and resources, and sign up for our newsletter.